In this demonstration, we're going to look at configuring a Radius server to support a remote access solution. Currently, we have routing and remote access configured on this Windows server, and it's providing VPN connections for remote clients. Once you have several servers set up, each with their own unique set of access policies, things can get confusing and hard to manage. What we want to do is install and configure a Radius server in our network and configure all our remote servers to use one Radius server for authentication, authorization, and accounting. That way, I can define one single set of network policies on the Radius server and then apply them to each one of my routing and remote access servers automatically. That way, if I need to make a change, I make the change in one place that's automatically applied to all of my remote access servers instead of having to make that change manually on each and every one. As you can see, the server has two network interfaces installed. This interface is a private network segment. This one is connected to the public network that has internet access. Any requests going out to the internet have to go through this public-facing interface. In addition, this interface is the one that's configured to accept remote access connections coming in from the internet, which are then forwarded onto this internal network segment right here. Let's go ahead and configure a Radius server that we can use for this remote access server. I'm going to switch over to a different Windows server. As you can see, this server is called CorpNetRad, and it's going to be our Radius server. Its network interface is connected to the same public-facing network that my remote access server is. I've already added the network policy server role on this server, but it's not configured. Let's take care of that now by going to Tools. We'll go to Network Policy Server. What we want to do is use Network Policy Server on this Radius server to create a policy that will be applied to all of our remote access servers and the network. For example, we could create a policy that restricts VPN access to a certain time window. Maybe work hours from 6 in the morning until 6 at night. Let's go ahead and do that. We'll expand policies. We'll click on Network Policies. As you can see, two policies are created by default. They're enabled and they're set to deny access. Using this policy without making any changes would basically deny access to everybody. We need to make a policy that enables access. Let's right-click over here, click on New. Let's name this policy Remote Access. We'll apply it to remote access servers. Next, we need to add conditions. Remember, we said that we want to restrict access to a certain time window during the day. We go down to Day and Time Restrictions and click on it. Click Add. We have to specify what the time window is. We want to set that window from 6 in the morning until 6 at night, Monday through Friday. We want to permit access during this window. We'll click OK and click Next. We want to grant access if the client connections match the conditions of this policy. In other words, if the connection is made between 6 in the morning and 6 at night, we're going to grant access. Click Next. We need to configure which authentication methods will be allowed with this policy. I want to turn off MS Chat, which will require our users to use at least MS Chat v2. Click Next. We don't want to configure any constraints. Click Next. We do want to make sure that at least a basic level of encryption is being used. Notice there's an option here that allows no encryption. That's not a good idea. We're going to turn that option off so we're at least using some form of encryption. Click Next, click Finish. And now our policy is defined. If a remote client system accesses our remote access server using a VPN connection, for example, between 6 in the morning and 6 at night, they'll be granted access. If, on the other hand, they try to establish a connection outside of that time window, then they'll be denied by these policies down here. The next thing we need to do is add a remote access server as a Radius client. To do that, we come up here and expand Radius Clients and Servers. Go to Radius Clients. There aren't any clients right now because we barely installed Network Policy Server on the system. We need to add a new Radius client. This can be confusing because we're adding a remote access server as a client. Sometimes when people hear the term Radius client, they think of a workstation because that's what we associate clients with. When you're working with Radius, that's not necessarily the case. In fact, it's very likely that the Radius client is actually going to be another server, and that's the case here today. So we want to enable the Radius client. I'll right-click and select New. We need to give it a friendly name. Let's just call it CorpNet because that's the name of the remote access server that we want to add. We need to add the IP address of that server, which is 207.63.1.1. We need to find a shared secret. The shared secret is used to authenticate the Radius client with the Radius server. We could generate it, or we can just create it manually. That's what I'm going to do. It's important to remember what you typed here because you'll have to use it again on the remote access server itself when you configure the Radius connection on it. The value supplied here on the Radius server must match the value that you configure on the Radius client. Click OK. We have our CorpNet server. Our remote access server is added and the network policy server has connected a Radius client. We need to go over to our remote access server and configure it to use the Radius server for authentication. Now we're on our remote access server. To configure the settings, I need to go up to Tools and select Routing and Remote Access. We'll go over to our server here, right-click and select Properties. We'll go to the Security tab. Notice we have the authentication provider and the accounting provider. If you choose this drop-down, we can see we have Windows Authentication and Radius Authentication. For this configuration, we don't want to use Windows Authentication. We want to use Radius Authentication and point to the Radius server we just set up. I'm going to select Configure and we'll add the IP address or DNS name of the Radius server that we just configured. That IP address was 207.63.1.2. Now we have to enter in that shared secret that we configured so that this server can authenticate to the Radius server. Hit OK again. At this point, our authentication service is going to be provided by the Radius server. However, notice down here that accounting is still going to be provided by the Windows system, and we don't want that. We want to do the same thing here. We could use a different server for that, but in this case, we're going to use the same server. I'll choose Radius Accounting here and then click Configure. I'll enter my IP address again, and now the shared secret, and then click OK on all these boxes. All right, now when a remote user establishes a VPN connection to our remote access server here, what's going to happen is those authentication requests are going to be passed over here to our Radius server. Let me switch over to our Radius server. Now those credentials will be checked to make sure that they're valid. Once they are, the network policy that we just defined will be applied. The nice thing about this is now I can go and add all of my other remote access servers as Radius clients as well. And then this network policy will be applied uniformly to every single remote access server in my network. If I make one change here, it's automatically applied to all those servers. That's it for this demonstration. In this demo, we talked about configuring a Radius server. First, we talked about the benefits of using Radius, then we configured a Radius server on a Windows system, and then we configured a Windows remote access server to use that Radius server for authentication and accounting.